Hey guys, tonight we journey back to the smoky, mud-splattered alleys of medieval villages where your stomach might want to tap out before your imagination does. The sky's a dull gray, pigs root around under the table, and a woman in a stained apron hands you something that looks like a cookie, but smells like iron and vinegar. You're about to take a bite of what was once a standard afternoon treat, a blood and barley biscuit. This isn't just any biscuit. It's made from barley flour, the medieval version of whatever's cheap, blended with a generous helping of fresh pig's blood. You know, the kind collected during slaughter and carefully stirred until it thickens like pudding. And don't imagine this was rare. No, this was a peasant's daily delight. It was warm, filling, and if you ignored the metallic tang, kind of nutritious. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're still with me, let me know your location and what time it is where you're watching. I love seeing how far and wide we wander together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You crouch by the hearth, holding this lumpy brown patty between two soot-blackened fingers. It's crusty around the edges, slightly soggy in the middle, and smells vaguely like pennies. That's the blood. The barley, on the other hand, gives it a chew that could exercise your jaw. Now, blood might sound horrifying today, but back then, it was just another ingredient, almost too precious to waste. In fact, many rural families looked forward to blood collection days the way you might await payday. And let's not forget, this was protein-rich. In a world where meat was a rare luxury for most, blood was the next best thing. And unlike meat, it didn't need much preservation. If you kept it cool and stirred it constantly, it would keep just long enough to end up baked into one of these delicacies. Blood pancakes in Sweden, still around. Blood sausage in the UK, alive and well. But medieval Europe took it further. Blood and barley were just the beginning. In lean seasons, that dough might also contain sour milk, mashed turnips, or even ashes for bulk. Ashes, as in the burnt leftovers from the hearth. It's unclear whether that was culinary innovation or just utter desperation. Historians still argue whether this ash inclusion was intentional or merely a sign of unhygienic kitchens. Your first bite crunches a little more than expected. Could be sand, or maybe a bit of straw. Grain threshing wasn't exactly precise. Plus, the idea of sifting for foreign matter hadn't quite caught on yet. You chew slowly. The texture is gritty, and the flavor? Imagine a liver smoothie stirred into warm, flat beer. But hey, it's better than starving. Strangely, these biscuits also served a social purpose. When food was tight, families would press the youngest or oldest into making these from scratch, mixing, shaping, cooking over an open flame. Kids were taught early to honor the pig by not wasting a drop. If you turned your nose up at blood food, you were considered soft, ungrateful, a bad omen for future harvests. Even, you glance across the room, and an old man nods at your biscuit. He holds his own up like a toast. His has more lumps, possibly congealed fat or the occasional scab of dried marrow. You smile politely and chew again, a little slower. Here's a fun fringe detail. Some medieval cooks added herbs like tansy or wormwood to mask the iron flavor. Tansy is toxic in large amounts, by the way, but that didn't stop them. The logic seemed to be, if it smells medicinal, it must be good. Spoiler, it wasn't. But it certainly made the whole biscuit taste like licorice dipped in motor oil, which somehow distracted from the blood. Small wins? Now imagine a cold morning, mist rolling in, and these biscuits being handed out to field workers at dawn. Breakfast on the go. You munch, you cough, you keep walking. Maybe you dip it in thin onion soup if you're lucky. Or more commonly in watered-down ale. Yes, even children drank weak ale, safer than the water, which often came with bonus bacteria. And the weirdest part? These biscuits weren't even considered poor quality. In some places like northern France or parts of the British Isles, they were even served during feast days. A kind of thank you pig snack before the better cuts came out. Modern chefs sometimes try to recreate them at food festivals, though often with beet juice or food coloring instead of real blood. One chef admitted that even with all her skill, the results still tasted like metal oatmeal with a haunting aftertaste. She smiled when she said it, but you could see the memory flicker behind her eyes. And you, still holding your half-eaten medieval snack, now understand why these didn't quite make it to the modern charcuterie board. But you also begin to respect the ingenuity, the way people took what they had and made it stretch. No part wasted. Even the blood that drained into a wooden bowl became breakfast. Before you move on, you look around the imaginary kitchen one last time. A sack of barley sits open near the door. A pig squeals somewhere outside. A wooden spoon drips red batter onto the floor. The hearth glows, and a child stirs a pot with both hands, careful not to burn their sleeves. And the scent of hot iron and burnt bread? Somehow it lingers on your breath. You haven't even digested your blood biscuit yet. And now someone's handing you a bowl of custard. You're hopeful briefly. Maybe it's a sweet break. Something creamy and warm with cinnamon? You peek inside and your stomach does a backflip. It's grayish. It wobbles. It smells briny. That's because this isn't your grandma's dessert. It's fish custard. Specifically, a creamed eel pudding straight from the banquet tables of medieval nobility. Eel was a big deal back then. Not some niche menu item for sushi fans, but a widespread, shockingly versatile source of protein. The rivers of England and France practically squirmed with them. And unlike meat, eel was allowed during fasting days, which, plot twist, covered almost half the calendar. If you were a good Christian medieval diner, you were skipping meat multiple times a week. But fish? Totally allowed. Hence, eel custard. Now picture this. The cook skins the eel if they're generous, boils it until it's gelatinous, then mixes it with milk, egg yolks, sugar, and sometimes rose water. It's baked or steamed until set, then sprinkled with nutmeg to cover the fishy aroma. You scoop a spoonful. It's warm, jiggly, slightly sweet, and tastes exactly like someone left a tuna sandwich in the sun. Still, this was considered elegant, especially at court. Rich people liked their foods fancy, unexpected, and confusing. Take fish in Lent, a dish that looked like roast beef but was made of layered white fish and eel dyed with beet juice. Historians still argue whether this was sincere religious creativity or just medieval trolling. And eel wasn't just common, it was currency. Literally. Some peasants paid rent in eels. Records survive listing thousands delivered to landlords. 15,000 silver eels. Reads one 12th century account. Which means if you didn't like eating them, you might still have to raise them, count them, and carry buckets of them to your local lord. Imagine wrangling a slimy mortgage payment. Now, the custard isn't the only fish-based surprise in your medieval snack tray. There's also something the cook proudly calls Jellied de poisson. Sounds fancy, right? You tip the wooden bowl and it glistens in the firelight like a melted lava lamp. It's a fish jelly, boiled fish bones strained into a broth, then cooled until the natural collagen congeals. That's your jelly base. Into it, slivers of trout, pike, or eel. If you're lucky, a few herbs. If not, you get the occasional scale or eyeball. And yes, this dish was served cold, often to guests, on purpose. You bring the bowl closer, and the jelly trembles. You know the feeling, like Jell-O but haunted. As you spoon a piece into your mouth, the texture is like biting into a chilled slug. The fishy essence hits hard, then fades into something oddly sweet. Sugar was expensive, but a tiny bit made the dish more refined. Supposedly, not to be outdone by fish desserts, some kitchens upped the ante with marzipan fish molds. Yes, almond paste shaped like fish, but some cooks hid real minced fish inside them. Dessert roulette medieval style. One bite's almond bliss. The next, anchovy surprise. Apparently it was hilarious. For someone. What's truly strange is how proud people were of these dishes. A banquet without at least one fish-based pudding would seem low-class. You can imagine the host whispering, "Don't worry, we've got the eel blancmange," and everyone sighs in relief, totally ignoring the nervous twitches of the visiting monks. Here's a fringe detail for your dreams tonight. Some fish puddings used almond milk instead of dairy, especially during Lent. That's right, medieval chefs made their own nut milk by grinding almonds and boiling them in water. Sounds modern? Maybe. But then they'd mix it with pickled herring and expect applause. Bon appetit. A notable fact. Fish jelly was often dyed for visual effect. Saffron for gold, spinach for green, crushed cochineal insects for red. Medieval food wasn't just gag-worthy, it was theatrical. Peacocks served with feathers reattached, pastries shaped like castles, and of course eels pretending to be custard. Historians still debate whether these recipes were meant to be delicious, symbolic, or just show-offy food stunts. You lean back, stomach protesting, eyes half shut from this sensory ambush. A servant clears the bowls, leaving behind a lingering scent of brine and nutmeg that clings like a wet cloak. The fire crackles. Someone starts playing a lute in the corner. You suspect it's a distraction from the burps echoing across the hall. For peasants, by the way, fish custard wasn't even an option. They got the plain version. Boiled eel with turnips. No eggs, no sugar, no decorative glaze. Just wet fish and sadness. Children learned to eat it early or go to bed hungry. Over time, their palates adapted. Yours? Not so much. Still, you have to admire the creativity. No refrigeration. No problem, just congeal it. Got excess fish? Blend it with sweetened herbs and hope it passes for dessert. Nothing wasted, everything stretched. Your appetite, most of all. You stretch your legs under the banquet table, dodging a stray hound gnawing on a fish spine. A noblewoman next to you dabs her lips delicately, then whispers to her maid to bring more jelly. You shudder. Not because of the request, because she means it. The fish pudding has cooled further in your stomach, hardening like regret. You try to focus on the flickering shadows on the stone wall. Anything but what you just swallowed. And just when you think it's over, Someone passes you a wooden tray. On it, a single gleaming spoonful of pale pink cream. You ask what it is. Pike mousse, they say cheerfully. It's whipped. It's fluffy. It's made entirely of pulverized fish and the chef's deepest ambition. You smile, because there's no escape. You're still reeling from the fish custard when the smell hits you. It's rich, earthy, almost nutty, and then it turns, like something left too long behind a radiator. A wooden platter is set before you with great ceremony, and on it, cheese. Not the kind that comes in neat slices or tidy plastic wrap, but ancient, oozing wheels that wobble at the edges and, oh yes, move, because nestled in the folds of this cheese are maggots. Plump little ones, twitching slightly under the surface. Welcome to the world of medieval moldy cheese, some of it so alive it could file taxes. Your host leans in proudly. Aged to perfection, he says, slicing off a sliver. It droops slightly, the texture more pudding than cheddar. You watch him eat it and smile, apparently satisfied. You're less sure. You poke your piece with a knife. Something wiggles. Maggot cheese, while not entirely unique to the Middle Ages, did enjoy a special kind of stinky stardom during that era. In regions of southern Europe, soft cheeses were often left to ferment in cellars, where flies laid eggs in the creamy rinds. The larvae broke down fats and proteins into a smoother, more spreadable texture. According to some, this made the cheese taste piquant. According to your nose, it makes the room uninhabitable. One particular variety, now illegal in most places, still lives on in Sardinia today. Casu marzu, literally rotten cheese. But back in the Middle Ages, similar maggot-laced dairy was consumed far and wide, especially in mountainous regions where milk spoiled fast, and people developed what can only be described as a horrifyingly adaptive tolerance. Historians still argue whether people were fully aware of the maggots or just politely ignored them. Some claim it was considered a sign of quality aging. Others say it was the result of poor storage and an still edible mentality. Either way, you're faced with the fact that people deliberately spread this on bread. And this wasn't just for the poor. Wealthy nobles, especially those trying to show off a refined palate, would serve ripened cheeses during dessert courses. After the gilded swan and the fish jelly, of course. One nobleman even wrote to a distant cousin about a fine blue cheese that burned the tongue and brought tears of joy. The joy part is questionable. You tear off a chunk of coarse, gritty bread, blackened from overbaked barley flour, and smear a bit of the cheese on top. The texture is like glue. The taste? Surprisingly sharp, almost like brie, but with a disturbing squish as your tongue grazes something that moves. You're not hallucinating. The maggots are alive. And yes, they jump. In fact, medieval diners knew to cover their eyes when biting in, as the larvae could leap up to 6 inches. Chefs sometimes chilled the cheese to slow them down, but cold fridge wasn't exactly a phrase yet. A popular fringe remedy involved dunking the cheese in vinegar to kill the bugs before serving. Didn't help the flavor much, but at least dinner stopped trying to escape. What's more, these cheeses were not always made from cow milk. Sheep, goat, even mare's milk were fair game. The type of animal often determined the level of funk. Goat cheese? Tangy. Mare's milk cheese? Sour enough to clear your sinuses. Cow? Milder but more prone to molding, especially in damp English basements. But not all mold was unwelcome. In fact, certain blue cheeses, like Roquefort, were prized for their veiny appearance. These were stored in caves to encourage the right fungal growth. Unfortunately, not all cheesemakers knew the difference between good mold and deadly spores. More than a few people met their end from spoiled dairy, mistaking fuzzy toxins for harmless aging. The line between aged beautifully and you're about to see God was paper thin. And don't think this was a private shame. Cheese was a community affair. Families often kept aging wheels in pantries, hanging them in cloth sacks to discourage rodents. Not that it worked. Occasionally, entire wheels were gifted at weddings or seasonal festivals. Imagine being handed a sack of hairy, breathing cheese and being expected to say thank you. Now imagine carrying it home without crying. There's even evidence of monks crafting ultra-stinky cheeses on purpose, believing the intensity mirrored spiritual devotion. The more pungent the cheese, the holier the monk. They'd scrape the rinds weekly, rub them with brine or beer, and pray no one fainted. A few monastic orders had cheese cellars so smelly that novices were warned to enter with humility and a strong stomach. You try to distract yourself by staring into the fire. But it's no use. The cheese is still on your plate, glistening slightly in the candlelight. You tell yourself it's just aged dairy. People eat blue cheese all the time today, right? But modern blue cheese doesn't usually writhe when served. The woman across from you nibbles hers like it's a grape. You're amazed. You're also pretty sure she hasn't blinked in 5 minutes. A mainstream historical tidbit. In the 14th century, English laws tried to regulate cheese quality, especially for trade. Inspectors would test for spoilage and foreign substances, but standards were wildly inconsistent. One tale tells of a merchant fined for selling cheese with straw, pebbles, and an entire beetle colony embedded. Still, he argued it added flavor. Bold. There's also this fringe case. A French noblewoman in 1321 wrote a letter complaining that her favorite cheese no longer had the sting it once did, and accused the cheesemaker of removing the worms too early. Hard to say whether she was joking or dangerously serious. You take one last bite, determined to earn your medieval badge of honor. It squishes. Something crunches faintly, and you realize you've passed the point of no return. Across the room, a cat eyes the platter hungrily. You push it toward her. Let her enjoy it. You've had enough living dairy for one night. You're dreaming of modern cheese, soft and mellow, perhaps on a clean cracker, when the next course arrives, and this one doesn't bother pretending to be polite. It's a glistening black sausage, coiled like a question mark, still steaming faintly. The scent is unmistakable, thick, coppery, with a spicy undertone that tries to hide something feral. You're face to face with a blood sausage, and unlike your first blood biscuit, this one's unapologetically raw in purpose. It's called black pudding in some regions, blutwurst in others, and in the medieval world, it was a thrifty delicacy, especially beloved after a good slaughter. Nothing went to waste, especially not blood, which spoiled quickly unless cooked into something useful. And so they did what any resourceful and slightly unhinged cook would do. They made it a snack. This sausage is made from animal blood, often pig or sheep, mixed with oatmeal, barley, fat, and herbs. Sometimes onions, sometimes breadcrumbs, sometimes chopped lungs or bits of organ that defy polite naming. It's all stirred together and funneled into intestines, then boiled or fried. The result? A dense, dark tube of iron-rich mystery meat. You cut into it. The inside is dark maroon, nearly black, and shiny. It crumbles slightly, leaving streaks of red on the plate. You take a bite. It's rich, gritty, warm, and tastes like licking the inside of a battlefield helmet. The oats add texture, but nothing hides that unmistakable blood flavor. It's primal. Somewhere deep inside you, a caveman grunts in approval. The rest of you whimpers. Medieval folks didn't see this as disgusting. Far from it. Blood pudding was comfort food, a reward after the labor of slaughter. In farming villages, it was a highlight of pig-killing day, when neighbors gathered to turn one animal into a month's worth of meals. Children helped stir the blood. Women seasoned the sausage. Men drank ale and sharpened blades. Your modern sensibilities are screaming, but to them it was a party, and there were versions for every class. Nobles had spiced versions with pepper, cloves, and saffron. Peasants had the rough stuff, coarser grains, more filler, and occasionally hunks of coagulated blood. One 13th century recipe calls for a pinch of salt and much patience, which feels like a warning more than an instruction. Historians still argue whether certain versions of blood sausage were used in ritual offerings. Some records suggest that seasonal festivals, especially harvest time, included ceremonial blood dishes offered to both saints and soil. Did they believe the land needed feeding? Or were they just practical, deeply hungry farmers inventing sacred excuses to eat well? Hard to say. Now for the fringe detail. Some blood sausages were sweet. Yes, really. Honey and dried fruits were added to the mix, especially in monasteries or during feasts. Imagine biting into a sausage that's equal parts fig, cinnamon, and blood clot. You can't? Well, someone did. There's a French variation known as Boudin Noir aux pommes, which pairs pork blood with stewed apples. In theory, the tart fruit cuts the metallic taste. In practice, it just makes you feel like you're eating dessert and open-heart surgery at the same time. Still, this odd pairing survived centuries. Today, it's a delicacy in parts of France, where people knowingly order it and still sleep at night. Your plate isn't done yet. Next to the sausage coil is a fried triangle of something grayish. You ask the cook what it is. Lung pudding, he says without blinking. Not liver, lung. The texture is chewy, airy, and disturbingly bouncy. It absorbs the flavor of the sausage next to it, meaning now your whole meal tastes like a blacksmith's glove marinated in molasses. But if you think you can escape by switching to soup, think again. The medieval version of broth often included blood as a thickener. Blood potage was especially common in Eastern Europe, where it was seasoned with vinegar and cloves, served hot from a cauldron, and accompanied by rye bread as dense as granite. You sip politely. It coats your throat like warm syrup and leaves your breath smelling like a rusty fence. Still, there's something eerily comforting about it. The warmth, the spices, the way it briefly tricks your brain into thinking this is just a really intense stew. Until, of course, you reach the bottom, where little red flecks have settled, like a crime scene waiting to be investigated. You glance around the hall. Others are slurping happily. One man even wipes his beard with a slice of bread before eating it. You're clearly the odd one out. A mainstream historical note. Blood dishes were heavily regulated in some cities due to spoilage risk. In 14th century London, Butchers were required to use or discard blood within hours. Anyone caught storing it in warm weather could be fined or flogged. That didn't always stop them, of course. Where there was blood, there was pudding. And where there was pudding, there was profit. There's even a documented scandal in Prague where a sausage seller was accused of stretching the blood with animal urine to increase volume. He was publicly whipped. His customers were publicly nauseated. Some parts of Europe got creative. In Poland, a dish called czernina used duck blood to thicken soup. It was considered romantic, yes, really, when a girl served it to a suitor she didn't like. Rejected by soup. Cold duck blood soup. Middle Ages 1. Romance 0. As you finish your sausage, someone passes a bowl of clotted cream. You sigh with relief, something soft and neutral. But no, this one's mixed with marrow and lard. A restorative spread, they say. You stare at the fatty swirl, which glistens like candle wax, and realize dessert may never come. You push your plate away and lean back. Your tongue feels metallic. Your breath could cauterize wounds. Across the hall, a dog growls softly at your feet, licking the drops you dripped in self-defense. You've eaten blood. In multiple forms. You've crossed that threshold, and there's no going back. You're starting to feel full, but not in a good way. Not the cozy, blanket-wrapped fullness of a warm stew or buttery bread. No, this is the creeping, existential fullness that comes from knowing you've just consumed the entire circulatory system of a barnyard animal in 3 different textures. But then, good, a break. A light snack is being passed around, something to cleanse the palate. They say, you should know better by now. A servant lays it on the table. A baked pastry of sorts, dome-shaped and crusty. Smells weirdly sweet. You lean in. Something sulfuric and vaguely sweaty wafts up. One crack of the flaky shell reveals the surprise. Pigeon pie. Now, this isn't just any pigeon pie. No, this one is stuffed with giblets, chopped heads, feet, and, because why stop there, whole hard-boiled songbird eggs. The inside is slick with gelatinous meat jelly, and the crust is soaked halfway through with oily drippings. Welcome to the delightful realm of medieval bird pies, where the pastry is the only innocent part. You try to keep an open mind. After all, pigeons were a staple of medieval diets, especially in urban settings where the birds were abundant and easy to catch. Nobles even maintained dovecots on their estates, raising flocks for the express purpose of turning them into things like this bird pudding wrapped in carbs. It's not just pigeon either. Dishes could include starlings, blackbirds, or even small thrushes, stuffed inside each other like poultry nesting dolls. A real delicacy might use a peacock or swan on the outside, with smaller birds baked inside, feathers reattached afterward for dramatic effect. Historians still argue whether these were meant to be eaten or merely admired, as many noble households would parade these showpiece pies before the guests, who oohed and awed, and then ate something else. A forkful of this pie reveals chewy gray meat and something uncomfortably crunchy. You hesitate, then you remember birds have bones. Many pies didn't even bother removing them, because medieval diners, champions of jaw strength and dental resilience. You're not so lucky, and it wasn't just about flavor. These pies were sometimes engineered to move. Yes, move. There's a documented trend in royal banquets of baking pies with live animals sealed inside. Birds, frogs, even snakes. When the crust was cut open, Out they flew, panicked, disoriented, and covered in gravy. It was meant to delight. You try to imagine clapping politely while a disoriented blackbird flaps across your soup. It doesn't quite land. This is where nursery rhymes start to look darker. Remember, 4 and 20 blackbirds baked in a pie? That's not a metaphor. That was Tuesday. Your hostess beams at you. That one's got sparrow brains, she says, as if listing chocolate chips in a muffin. You nod politely, mouth glued shut. The preparation methods, as usual, varied by region and budget. Wealthy kitchens had the tools and space to bake layered meat pies with intricate designs. The crusts, called coffins, were rarely eaten and used mainly to hold everything together. But in peasant households, the crust was dinner, especially if it soaked up enough juice to disguise the bland flour. A thrifty cook might reuse the same pastry mold several times, scooping out the contents and refilling with new meat like medieval Tupperware. One mainstream fact: in the 15th century, detailed cookbooks like the For Me of Curry included recipes for these pies. The language is charmingly vague. Tacky a fowl and chop him with savory and poudre fort, and assumes you've got your own private butcher and infinite time. Still, it gives us a window into their palate. Gamey, greasy, and often spiced into submission with mace, cloves, or saffron. You hit something in your slice that's neither meat nor bone. It's an egg, entire, shelled, and barely firm. It's nested inside like a gross little treasure. The yolk is dark, the whites slightly translucent. You chew slowly, thoughtfully. Tastes like dusty smoke and barn. Then comes the fringe detail. Some pies included digestive aids, bits of rue, pepper, or vinegar intended to help your body survive the onslaught. One notorious version mixed in bits of dried hyssop and wormwood, which may or may not have helped digestion, but definitely added bitterness. A noblewoman once claimed it cleared her humors so thoroughly she couldn't stop sweating for 2 days. Science. Even weirder, some pies weren't meant to be eaten at all. Soteltes, spelled like someone sneezed while typing, were ornate, symbolic dishes meant to amuse or instruct. Think pies shaped like castles, animals, or scenes from morality plays. One documented pie had a tiny baked figure of a knight fighting a snail inside, possibly a satire or a very confusing appetizer. You push your slice away, glancing at the table beside you. There, a man is spooning meat jelly from his pie and mixing it with fermented mustard seed mash. He eats it with obvious pleasure, dipping it with a stale hunk of trencher bread that was originally someone's plate. Because yes, bread was often a plate. Thick, hard rounds of bread called trenchers were used to serve food, then eaten or given to the poor afterward. Some diners soaked theirs in bird grease and declared it dessert. Others scraped the bread clean and pretended that made it hygienic. And hygiene, as you've probably guessed by now, was not a high priority. Bird pies were cooked until mostly done, often left sitting for hours during feasts, and reheated with questionable technique. One recipe cheerfully recommends warming over a candle until the crust steams, which sounds less like cooking and more like a fire hazard. Still, the social status of these dishes mattered more than their bacterial content. A man who served you a hot pigeon pie with whole quail eggs and a crust shaped like a lion was someone to be respected, or at least feared. You take one more nibble. The crust is soft from juices. The meat is warm. You try not to wonder how long it's been sitting. Across the room, a small child grabs a bird leg from someone's plate and begins gnawing it like a lollipop. Nobody bats an eye. This was normal. This was food. This was how people feasted, laughed, and occasionally survived. You lean back. The pie settles like a sandbag in your gut, and you realize there are still 10 sections to go. So far, you've munched through curdled milk chunks, slurped iron-rich sausage, and survived an avian pastry surprise. You'd think it's time for a digestive. A little fruit, perhaps. A cool medieval melon slice. But no. Tonight's next delicacy is less about cleansing and more about questioning your entire relationship with what constitutes food. The server presents you with a wooden bowl, its contents squirming under the dim candlelight. You blink. It's moving, or at least it was recently. You're looking at cheese, but not just any cheese. This one is alive. Welcome to the unforgettable, the unthinkable, and quite possibly illegal maggot cheese. Let's get the polite name out of the way. It's called casu marzu, and while technically Sardinian and not widely documented in most medieval texts, it embodies the same spirit of risk, thrift, and questionable fermentation that defined many medieval snacks. The cheese starts its life as ordinary pecorino, but when it starts to ferment past normal safety levels, cheese flies are introduced, yes, intentionally, to lay eggs. These hatch into translucent maggots that help decompose the fats, softening the core into a creamy, pungent paste. And you're supposed to eat it while the maggots are still alive. A mainstream historical fact. While casu marzu isn't mentioned explicitly in medieval cookbooks, the practice of eating moldy or fermented foods crawling with cheese worms is. Across Europe, farmers and peasants didn't throw away spoiled cheese. They celebrated it. A strong, stinky cheese meant you had endurance, good storage, and no fear of protein that looked back at you. You lift your spoon. The cheese trembles. A few larvae are leaping. Yes, these maggots can jump, up to 15 centimeters if startled, which means you, currently spoon in hand and visibly panicking, are a threat. Wear goggles, they said. You didn't listen. Now, to be fair, not all medieval cheese was maggot-riddled. But it was rarely the sanitized supermarket brick you know today. Cheese back then was a wild, variable product, aged in cellars, soaked in brine, smoked over hearths, or buried underground for months to intensify flavor. Some cheeses were hard enough to chip a tooth. Others dripped with ammonia-scented goo, and people loved them because back then funky cheese meant good bacteria. Probably. Historians still argue whether medieval Europeans understood fermentation as a process or just saw it as divine rot. Either way, they leaned into it. There are records of monastery-aged cheeses being sold with proud descriptions like biteth the tongue or smelleth like thunder. Yes, thunder. That's either a very poetic way to say sharp, or someone got struck while sniffing it. But let's get back to your bowl of living dairy. The flavor, pungent, doesn't begin to cover it. It's like blue cheese cranked to 11, with a texture somewhere between creamy brie and warm frosting left in a sunlit car. Your mouth burns slightly, partly from ammonia compounds, partly from shame. The maggots wriggle between your teeth. You pretend it's al dente. You lie to yourself. Here's a fun tidbit from the fringes. Some households in remote regions would make their own insect cheese by leaving milk out, intentionally inviting flies, then letting nature handle the rest. These were often used medicinally. Yes, eaten to cleanse the bowels. If you weren't sick before eating it, you probably would be after. But hey, two birds, one regurgitating stomach. And lest you think this was purely a rural madness, some noble courts dabbled in strong cheeses as status symbols. A particularly robust will might be presented at a feast, carved with the host's coat of arms, then sliced dramatically while guests recoiled and pretended to enjoy it. A taste for the refined, they called it. Your nose would call it a war crime. You push the bowl away, but there's no escape. The next plate arrives. A tart of fermented curd, sweetened with dried dates and seasoned with garlic. It's unclear whether this was a dessert or a dare. The crust is soggy. The filling is brownish yellow and flecked with herbs. You take a bite. It tastes like someone forgot to refrigerate yogurt for a week, then buried it next to a garlic clove and a cinnamon stick. The simultaneously sweet, sour, spicy, and somehow fizzy. You blink. Is that effervescence? Yes. The tart is lightly carbonated. That's not a feature, it's a symptom. This isn't a bug, by the way, it's literally the byproduct of medieval fermentation, which was often imprecise. They didn't have temperature control. They didn't have pasteurization. They had clay pots, linen wraps, salt, and a deep commitment to not wasting anything. Ever. So if it curdled weird, you leaned in. One known snack in the Alps involved taking goat cheese, soaking it in brandy, then wrapping it in cabbage leaves and burying it for 3 months. When it emerged, it had a rind like tree bark and a flavor described in one account as heroic. You don't know what that means. You don't want to find out. And yet, people wrote poetry about cheese. Monks traded it. Queens sent it as gifts. Charlemagne himself reportedly adored smelly cheeses from certain French regions, and once asked a bishop to supply him with more. Taste, it seems, is timelessly subjective. You're past a final plate. This one's meant to refresh you after the stronger flavors. It's a soft cheese with herbs folded in rosemary, thyme, and something that smells like sage. At last, you think, a reprieve. But of course, this one's been aged with strips of meat inside it. You slice in and discover veins of cured ham running through the cheese like marbling in a very confused steak. It's salty, it's chewy, it squeaks against your teeth. You accept that flavor as a suggestion, not a promise. And here's the kicker. There are records of people warming their cheese over candlelight, not to melt it, but to soften the outer layer so they could scoop the liquid center, which had fermented separately. A dual texture snack, like lava cake, but if lava cake had body odor and grew fungus. You push your chair back. Your stomach is staging a coup. There's a fine sheen of sweat on your upper lip. You've survived bird guts and blood paste. But this was cheese that looked at you with judgment. Still, you can't help but admire the sheer resilience of medieval people. They didn't flinch at maggots. They didn't mind mystery mold. They saw food as an evolving entity, alive, changing, unpredictable. Kind of like them. But you reach for a goblet of wine, and maybe a toothbrush. You lean back in your seat, lips tingling with ammonia and defeat, quietly negotiating with your insides. Your host claps their hands and announces, with far too much cheer, that it's time for something cooling. You exhale in relief. Finally, something soothing. A sorbet, a bit of fruit, not even close. Out comes a ceramic bowl filled with what looks like soup, but smells like something between lawnmower clippings and expired seafood. It's green and lumpy, The texture? Imagine porridge if porridge had been left out in the rain for a week. A servant informs you this is hedge pudding. You stare. Hedge pudding? You think about hedges. You think about pudding. You try to stop thinking. This particular concoction is made from boiled greens, nettle, sorrel, goosegrass, dandelion, wild fennel, chickweed, and just about anything else growing within arm's reach of a garden wall. The ingredients vary by region, but the goal is the same. Fill your belly with whatever didn't die over winter. A mainstream historical fact, hedge pudding and other foraged greens were survival staples, especially during the medieval hungry gap, those lean weeks between the end of stored winter food and the beginning of spring crops. In Britain and parts of Europe, peasants turned to hedgerows and forest edges for anything remotely edible. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept you alive. You spoon some into your mouth. It's bitter, so bitter. Your tongue retracts like a frightened cat. There's a gritty texture, probably soil, or crushed snail shell. You try not to speculate. Despite the horror show flavor, the dish had its defenders. Some believed that nettle, especially, cleansed the blood and removed winter's humors. Others claimed that eating from the land brought you closer to God. One eccentric monk even wrote that one must taste the sting of nature to feel humility. Easy for him, he wasn't chewing gravel in public. The fringe tidbit? Some hedge puddings included animal components. Not meat, exactly, but marrow scraped from bones, or even brains from butchered livestock, stirred into the mix for fat and protein. Bone broth? Sure. But bone mush poured over wild grass? That's a wellness trend that never quite took off. You spot someone beside you crumbling old bread into their hedge bowl, trying to thicken it up. Another diner adds a splash of vinegar. You try both. It now tastes like vinegary swamp. Progress? Historians still argue whether dishes like this were seen as meals or medicine. Some herbalists recorded hedge puddings as spring tonics, claiming they removed melancholia and improved digestion. Others warn that some included mildly toxic plants, like foxglove or hemlock, in small amounts, either from confusion or misguided faith in their benefits. So yeah, dinner roulette. Just as you begin to accept this leafy punishment, the next cooling snack arrives. Jelly, but not the fun, fruity kind. No, this one is made from boiled fish skin and bones, left to set in a trough, and then sliced into glistening squares. It's called aspic. Aspic was the medieval answer to Tupperware. Boil down animal parts until the collagen melts, let it cool, and voila. A wobbly meat jello that traps whatever you shove inside. Vegetables, herbs, whole fish heads. In they go. Think of it as nature's shrink wrap. If nature was into weird textural horror, your aspic glows slightly. You poke it. It jiggles menacingly. Then you bite. Cold fish fat greets your mouth with a slap. The jelly resists at first, then bursts into a slick slurry. There's a twig of thyme in there, maybe even a boiled egg slice. You can't tell. Your tongue is sending distress signals. But this wasn't just poor man's cuisine. In noble courts, aspic became a centerpiece, molded into elaborate shapes. Castles, flowers, even animals. One banquet served eel and chicken suspended in saffron-tinged aspic molded into a crown. Yes, a jiggling meat crown, fit for a king, or a therapy session. The flavor, historically speaking, was beside the point. Aspic was about preservation and presentation. It kept food from spoiling, masked off flavors, and looked impressive, at least until it melted under torchlight or someone sneezed. And let's not forget its cousin, vinegar jelly, a blend of boiled hooves, pigskin, and old wine, set into wobbly cubes with pickled onions and capers inside. It was refreshing, apparently, to those with no taste buds or a need for penance. As you chew reluctantly, slowly, you realize your bowl also contains bits of smoked fish, possibly herring, or carp, or rat. The line between fishy and feral is thin here. You reach for water, tastes faintly of metal, possibly the goblet, possibly the aqueduct. Either way, it's not helping. There's a pause in the meal. Someone is giving a toast. You zone out, focusing instead on the little pile of rejected hedge pudding in front of you. Steams slightly, ominously, like a warning. You glance around. Everyone's eating like this is normal, like they want to be here. The third cooling course slides in front of you. This one's a porridge of oats mixed with sour goat's milk and crushed garlic. It's meant to stimulate your senses. You take a breath, and then you do what must be done. You eat. It is foul. The garlic burns in your nose. The sourness makes your eyes water. But the oats are oddly comforting, soft, bland, familiar. You cling to them like a shipwrecked survivor clinging to driftwood. This is your safe zone now. Here's a historical side note. Cold grain porridges were eaten across Europe, often fermented slightly for added shelf life. Some were sweetened with honey, others spiced with mustard seed or pepper, and still others, especially in poorer regions, were left to sour into what amounted to edible glue. Thick, sticky, and somehow more filling than actual meals. You eat around the edges. You avoid the garlic pockets. You pretend you're back in modern times, enjoying overnight oats. You lie again. Someone offers you a dollop of wild mustard mash to add some zing. It's a mix of crushed seeds, old wine, and fish brine. You decline. Politely, this meal was meant to refresh you. Instead, it's rearranged your understanding of suffering. But it's also oddly honest. There's no polish here. No fluffy cakes or creamy sauces. Just survival seasoned with whatever was growing near a bush. And somehow, against all logic, you're still here. Still chewing. Still curious. Just maybe not curious enough to ask what's next. You slump in your seat, your tongue quietly weeping beneath layers of nettles, garlic porridge, and fish jello. You are a husk of your former self. Your palate has seen war. But the feast isn't over. From the far end of the table comes the clink of metal trays. Footsteps echo. A procession of servants arrives with expressions too cheerful to trust. And then you see them. Eggs. First, this feels like a gift. Eggs. Familiar. Wholesome. Potentially edible. But medieval eggs don't behave like your supermarket dozen. These have been boiled, roasted, pickled, buried, reshaped, stuffed, painted, and on occasion exploded. One particularly innovative dish is placed before you. It's called mock eggs. These aren't eggs at all, but cleverly disguised balls of meat and lard, rolled in crushed eggshell and painted with yellow dye to look the part. Why? For fun, obviously. You cut one open. Crumbles. The inside is grayish pink. There are raisins. And cloves? Tastes like sausage, but also like regret. Mock foods were huge in the medieval world. They loved culinary deception. You'd be handed a fruit tart and find fish inside. You'd crack what looked like an egg and be hit with minced pork and almonds. Historians still argue whether these were party tricks or symbolic gestures. Maybe even ways to skirt fasting rules imposed by the church. Because if it looks like an egg but isn't, does God still count it? Next to the mock egg is the real deal, or so they say. It's been boiled, shelled, halved, and filled with a blend of its own yolk, ground anchovies, and a splash of sour grape must. You know this recipe by its modern descendant, the deviled egg. But this is its gremlin ancestor. You bite. The filling is pungent, salty, and vaguely fishy. The texture's fine, but the flavor hits like a medieval insult. One noblewoman once described these as the devil's pearl, which sounds poetic, until you realize she meant it literally. People believed spicy foods could summon tempers, or worse, demons. A mainstream historical fact, eggs were a seasonal luxury. Hens laid mostly in spring and early summer, so preserved eggs were common. Pickled in brine, layered in ash, or soaked in vinegar and spices. The results? Often rubbery, sometimes sour, always suspicious. One dish from 13th century Spain involved boiling eggs in wine, honey, and pepper until the whites turned pink. It was served cold, sometimes with almonds and cinnamon. A medieval protein smoothie, if you will, one that smelled like a mulled wine mistake. Let's not forget egg stew, a peasant favorite. Scrambled eggs stretched with stale ale, leeks, and crushed mustard seed. It was heated in a clay pot and eaten with bread. Simple, right? Until you added the surprise ingredient, fish sauce. Yes, garum made its way into egg dishes, too. Your stomach braces. You're handed a spoonful of something smooth and beige. Egg pudding, the host declares. You ready yourself. This one's sweetened with honey and saffron, thickened with breadcrumbs. That doesn't sound too bad, you think. Okay, you relax. It's warm, vaguely custardy, and has only the faintest aftertaste of barn. You smile cautiously. Then they add the sauce, vinegar and rosewater. The pudding instantly curdles on your tongue. Your smile dies. This was common, actually. Combining savory and sweet in egg dishes was fashionable. The court of Richard II, for instance, delighted in egg tarts seasoned with ginger, sugar, and parsley, then drizzled with fish syrup, because boundaries did not exist. A fringe fact? Some people buried eggs in clay and dung to preserve them for winter. Not quite the century egg of Asia, but close. These were prized for their firmness and unique tang. Tang that your mouth isn't emotionally prepared for. You try to sip water, but someone hands you an egg drink instead. It's a posset, a hot blend of milk, egg yolk, and ale, spiced with nutmeg and thickened until lumpy. It was often given to the sick as a comfort food. You taste it. It tastes like someone melted eggnog and forgot to add joy. The texture clings, coats your throat like warm gravy. You try not to gag. Yet, despite all this, the egg was a beloved ingredient. The symbolism alone was powerful: life, fertility, rebirth. Monasteries bred hens for both eggs and meat, carefully rationing them out during holy periods. On Easter, eggs were painted red to represent Christ's blood, not for eating, just for showing off. Then, eventually, for eating anyway. One curious record mentions a tavern in Prague where pickled eggs were suspended in barrels of beer, absorbing the brine until they turned translucent. These were served on toothpicks to passers-by, a sort of medieval bar snack. Beer eggs. You pause. That almost sounds modern. You're offered one. You decline. Nearby, someone else bites in. Their eyes water. The egg-themed madness continues with egg pies. Not quiches. No. These are pie crusts filled with scrambled egg, cheese, and fruit? Yes. Apples or pears were commonly added. One 14th century recipe calls for hard-boiled eggs, dried apricots, and beef marrow baked into a custard. The result is dense, oily, and jarringly sweet. You try a slice. The crust is good. The filling is confusing. Your brain wants dessert. Your tongue detects meat fat. Your heart yearns for a refund. Still, you persist. You must. You owe it to history. As the plates clear, a final egg treat arrives. Painted shell sealed with wax. Inside, a raw yolk, pickled in vinegar and herbs for weeks, then gently smoked. The idea is to pierce it and suck out the contents. Like a medieval yolk shot, you consider fleeing. But curiosity, as always, wins. You sip. It's tart, smoky, slippery, and not nearly as awful as you expected. Is that satisfaction? Is your palate adapting? No, definitely not. But you finish it anyway. As the egg course ends, you sit back and wonder how one humble ingredient inspired so much chaos. The medieval mind saw the egg not as a static food, but a challenge. A base form waiting to be reshaped, stretched, and thoroughly confused. And you made it. Through deception, salt, vinegar, and yolk shot. You wipe your mouth. You do not smile. But deep down, part of you whispers, what fresh horror is next? You stare blankly at the table, hollow from yolks and vinegar. Your taste buds are waving little white flags. Surely, this has to be the worst of it. Then the next course appears, and your optimism promptly dies. It's a pie. That's good, right? Everyone loves pie. But the smell gives it away before you even touch it. Earthy, musky, just a touch sour. The crust is beautifully golden, though unervingly glossy. And when your knife pierces it, the filling oozes out in thick, dark clumps. You're told this is a game pie, which sounds kind of fun until you learn what's inside. Hedgehog. Yes, hedgehog. Spines removed, obviously, but otherwise intact. You blink at your host. They assure you this was a delicacy. Hogs bake well, they add, like that makes anything better. A mainstream historical fact. Game pies were a staple of noble feasts' status symbols. Really, they showcased a lord's hunting prowess and his cook's creativity. Inside one crust you might find rabbit, venison, swan, pigeon, or yes, hedgehog. Some pies even combined multiple animals into grotesque patchworks of meat. Mixed beast, they called it. You call it a meat lottery. You chew slowly. Hedgehog tastes like tough pork soaked in compost tea. There's also liver in here, and juniper berries. Your mouth is now a forest floor. Next comes a blackbird pie. No, not a nursery rhyme. A real pie filled with boiled songbirds. In some courtly circles, birds were baked inside pies alive, then released at the table for shock value. This one's thankfully dead, though the little feet sticking out make you wish it weren't here at all. The bones crunch in your mouth. You stop chewing. A fringe tidbit. One recipe from the 1400s calls for baking an entire cooked peacock, feathers and all, into a crust, then redressing it in its skin and setting it upright so it appears untouched. Some versions went further, adding fireworks or dyed flames. Medieval dinner was sometimes less fine dining, more dangerous puppet show. Your host cuts a slice of something pale and jelly-like, places it on your plate, and says, "Badger tranche." You don't make eye contact. Tranches were cold, pressed meat loaves, often layered with fat and offal. Badger was rare, but not unheard of, especially in rural areas where meat was meat and morals were optional. This one's been spiced with cloves and onion, then preserved in its own fat. The fat coats your tongue. The clove burns a little. You think you taste fur. You hope it's your imagination. Historians still argue whether these meats were daily fare for lower classes or strictly reserved for special hunts. Some records show peasants trapping small animals during famines. Others insist that game was protected under forest law. Killing the king's deer could earn you jail time or worse. So did people sneak badger pies under the radar? Almost certainly. But how often? That's still debated. You try to clear your throat. A servant offers hare pudding. You sigh. This one's minced hare meat, blended with breadcrumbs, dried plums, and vinegar. Steamed, then sliced like cake. The texture is oddly fluffy. The flavor, like raisin bread, had an argument with venison and lost. You nibble. You wonder, why the fruit? Because fruit plus meat was the height of sophistication. Sweet and savory was considered elevated. Think lamb with cherries or beef with pears. So adding raisins to hare? That was just being fancy. But the worst is yet to come. The showpiece is wheeled in. It's a giant pie, enormous, decorated with carved pastry swans and stars. The top lifts off like a lid. Inside is everything. Goose, chicken, trout, mutton, partridge, all layered like an ungodly meat trifle. Fat drips down the sides. The smell punches you in the lungs. Somewhere in there, you swear you hear a tiny scream. It's called a coffin pie, not for the faint of heart. Cooks packed these pies to last weeks, sometimes months. The crust was thick, almost inedible, designed to seal in the contents. It wasn't meant to be eaten, just breached. And breach it you do. The eel hits first, slippery, oily, heavily peppered. Then a mouthful of dried goose, fibrous and salty. Then something chewy. You don't want to know what. The spices are medieval staples, clove, mace, long pepper, but they don't mask the age of the meats. You think this might have been cooked last Thursday, of last year. You chase it down with a crust flake, which tastes like dried plaster. Good. A small side dish arrives. Quail, marinated in vinegar and honey, skewered and roasted whole. You pop it into your mouth and immediately regret it. It's mostly bone and char. Nearby, a server is carving roast otter. It glistens unnaturally. Someone describes it as like duck, but with a hint of fish. You pretend not to hear. This wasn't just dinner, it was a display. If your table groaned under the weight of exotic animals, it meant you had wealth, power, and very forgiving guests. Royalty sometimes imported giraffes, crocodiles, or even camels not to eat but to flaunt, though on occasion, someone did eat the giraffe. True story. One medieval feast featured a whole roasted dolphin. It was described as surprisingly tender. You shudder. As the final scraps are cleared, your belly is both full and afraid. You can't tell if you're nauseous, satisfied, or just broken. But one thing is certain. You will never look at a pie the same way again. Your eyes glaze over, your fork hand trembles, and you begin to suspect that this medieval feast is less about nourishment and more about personal transformation. Like a spiritual fast, but in reverse. Your soul leaves your body for just a moment, probably to find a snack that doesn't involve Hedgehog. But before it can return, your host claps their hands and declares it's time for the lighter course. You exhale. Relief. Finally. Something gentle. Maybe a salad? Nope. It's jelly. And not the kind that wobbles playfully in pastel colors. This is aspic, a clear, savory gelatin made from simmered animal bones and connective tissue. You look down at a shimmering mound that jiggles unnervingly every time someone walks by. It's translucent. Inside it, chunks of chicken, herbs, slivers of almond, and a whole egg yolk suspended mid-wobble like a sun trapped in amber. You spoon it delicately. It slurps. It's cold. Your teeth bounce off it before sinking into the rubbery meat suspended within. The flavor is equal parts broth, salt, and vague regret. A mainstream historical fact, aspic was an elite dish, not because it tasted amazing, but because it was hard to make. You had to simmer bones for hours, strain the liquid, cool it, and pray it gelled properly. In an age before refrigeration, getting a clean, firm jelly was like alchemy. Some aspics were even dyed with saffron or beetroot to enhance their shine, then molded into elaborate shapes. Fish, castles, even miniature coats of arms. One fringe detail, some aspics were meant to be part performance art. There's a record from Burgundy of a jelly shaped like a swan that flapped its wings when jostled. Guests were delighted, possibly also disturbed. You think this current jelly is flapping, but only from the vibrations of your fear. Next up, galantine. Another jelly cousin, this one made by boning out a bird, say a goose, then stuffing it with a blend of minced meat, dried fruit, nuts, and spices. It's rolled into a tube, poached, then chilled in aspic. You're served a cold slice, the cross-section revealing concentric rings like a meat tree. The texture is confusing, chewy and soft in turns. Bits of fig sneak up on you. You suddenly hit something crunchy. Nut, cartilage, mystery. You keep chewing. Galantines were show-off centerpieces. They could be dyed, sculpted, and adorned with gold leaf. Historians still argue whether they were served primarily for taste or for spectacle, because most diners, like you, seem to eat them while wearing the blank stare of culinary trauma. Another jelly dish hits the table. This one shaped like a fish, complete with peppercorn eyes. You prod it. It trembles back. Pike in aspic. Your host explains. You take a bite. The fish is mild, the jelly overpowering. Tastes like someone tried to pickle a pond. Then a twist. They bring out milk jelly, a sweet version. Surely this one will save you. It's made from almond milk, thickened with isinglass, fish bladder gelatin, sweetened with honey, and flavored with rosewater. It's creamy white and molded into the shape of a lamb. You take a bite. It's decent, soft, floral, faintly nutty. You relax a little until the aftertaste hits. A ghostly tang of old fish bladder, almond and anchovy, fused forever in your mouth. You reach for water, but are handed a goblet of Hippocras instead. A spiced wine served cold, often drunk alongside sweet courses. This one's steeped with cinnamon, ginger, and long pepper. It burns on the way down but smells like a Christmas candle, so you forgive it. A page boy places a platter of translucent cubes before you. They glisten like jewels. "This is quince jelly," he chirps. You thank him with what might be your last smile. Quince jelly is made from the cooked-down fruit, rich in pectin and naturally rosy in hue. This one is sweetened with honey and scented with clove. You bite in. It's firm, fragrant, and unexpectedly lovely. A win, at last. You savor it, slowly, suspiciously, but this sweet victory is short-lived. Another dish arrives. You can't even tell what it is at first. Just a lumpy beige block surrounded by smaller jelly blobs. Your host beams. "Pigs, trotters, and aspic," they announce proudly. You swallow a protest. Trotters, pig's feet, were boiled down until the skin and tendons turned to jelly. They were then cooled in a mold, sliced, and served cold. The aspic acts as both preservative and garnish. You try a forkful. It's slippery, chewy, vaguely porky. The texture is not of this world. But to peasants and nobles alike, this was efficient eating. Waste not, want not. Feet had collagen. Collagen made jelly. Jelly meant calories you didn't need to cook twice. In the dead of winter, a jellied meat preserved in cool storage could feed a family for days. Still doesn't help your gag reflex. Historians still debate how often commoners truly indulged in these elaborate jellies, or whether they simply used similar methods with simpler ingredients, like leftover grains or organ meats. Recipes in surviving manuscripts often feel extravagant, suggesting upper-class bias. But archaeology tells a Messier story. Bone fragments in cold pits, traces of collagen-rich broths, hinting that jellied leftovers might have been more common than records suggest. Another aspic appears. This one is bright orange. You ask, hesitantly, what's inside? Carrots and eels. You nod. Of course. You bite. The sweetness of the carrots clashes violently with the murky, oily eel. The aspic holds it together like nature's cruel rubber band. In one final flourish, your host presents the Jewel Tower, a three-tiered mold of colored jellies: rose, honey, and mint. Each layer is studded with almonds, candied fennel, and bits of venison jerky. You've long stopped asking why. You take one quivering bite. The mint slaps you. The meat confuses you. The almond crunches like judgment. And yet, there's something captivating about it all. The absurdity. The sheer determination to make jelly into everything except what it should be. These were people who could barely keep their food from spoiling, yet they dreamed of edible sculptures that wiggled. As your spoon clinks the empty plate, you glance down at your reflection in the jelly sheen. You don't recognize yourself anymore. You've changed. You're one with the aspic now. The jellies have jiggled their last, and you sit, glassy-eyed, halfway between despair and a full-blown hallucination. If someone wheeled out a roast unicorn right now, you'd just nod and say, "Sure, why not?" But your host clears their throat and announces with immense pride, "Now comes the dairy." You pause. Milk, butter, cheese. Harmless, right? Comforting, mild. Nothing weird can happen here, right? Wrong again. First arrives a ceramic crock of clout cream. It looks innocent enough. A thick white blob glistening like frosting. You dip a spoon in, scoop a little, taste, and your brain goes quiet for a second. Clout cream is essentially slowly heated, unpasteurized cow's milk. The cream rises and forms a wrinkled skin, like pudding left too long in the sun. Some people loved that part. You're not so sure. Tastes like warm butter and sour grass. The texture is clumpy. The aftertaste is haunting. Still, this is one of the more enduring items on the medieval menu. It's even still enjoyed in parts of England today. But back in the day, this was a luxury, a dairy-rich indulgence for the relatively well-off. You wonder if they genuinely liked it, or if they just hadn't discovered ice cream yet. Your host spoons something pale and shiny onto your plate and announces, "This is sapsago." You squint. Sapsago is a Swiss hard cheese made with blue fenugreek, giving it a greenish tinge and a pungent, herbal tang that punches your sinuses without warning. The texture is like chewing a very determined rock. It crumbles into chalky shards, releasing waves of hay, bitterness, and barnyard undertones. You try to swallow, but it fights you. Now a soft cheese arrives, possibly a brie ancestor. It's coated in ash. You ask if it's safe. Your host shrugs and says, "That's how you know it's mature. It tastes like something left behind in a forgotten backpack." And yet, you go back for a second bite. Maybe Stockholm Syndrome is setting in. A mainstream historical fact: dairy was a cornerstone of the medieval diet, especially for peasants. They couldn't always afford meat, but they had cows and goats. Milk was turned into butter, curds, or cheese, anything to make it last longer in a world without fridges. Nobles often preferred exotic imports or heavily spiced cheeses, while rural folk ate theirs fresh or smoked. But not all dairy was equal. The next platter is fermented milk soup. Yes, soup. This dish combines sour milk, barley, and herbs. It smells like old yogurt trying to be stew. You sip. The tang curdles in your throat. There's a chewy bit. You choose not to identify it. A servant then appears with a ladle and a smile. Whey water, she says, to aid digestion. Tastes like salty ghost tears. You ask for a break. Your host nods sympathetically and brings out butter with salt. Just that. A chunk of pale, cold butter, crusted in coarse salt. You nibble it like a cracker. It's not the worst. It's buttery and salty. And oh, there's a hair in it. One fringe detail. Butter wasn't always edible. Some was made for lamps or even waterproofing clothes. In fact, barrels of medieval butter could be so foul-smelling by modern standards that they were considered industrial, not culinary. And yet, in desperate times, people ate it, or used it to trade for fish, or to bribe monks. Multipurpose. Historians still argue whether certain cheeses, especially the riper, smellier ones, were eaten regularly or mostly reserved for rituals, medicine, or animal baiting. Some texts suggest monks prized pungent, runny cheeses during fasts. Others hint at farmers feeding overripe cheese to dogs or enemies. You'd believe either, honestly. A bowl of curds with honey arrives. This one, at last, is decent. Creamy, sweet, slightly tangy, like proto-cheesecake. You relax, until they bring out the cheese coffin. Not a metaphor. It's an aged cheese, served in its original crust. A rind thick and leathery, cracked like an ancient map. Inside ooze, sharp, acrid, almost fizzy. You take a small nibble. The flavor floods your sinuses like ammonia on a roller coaster. Your eyes water. Someone claps. You realize this cheese is aged with maggots. Not by accident. Certain regions considered maggoty cheese, like Italy's later casu marzu, a delicacy. The larvae were a sign of fermentation gone, right? This may or may not be one of those cheeses. Either way, it is very much alive. You discreetly do not finish it. Now comes the molded butter, sculpted into shapes of saints and animals. Soft, rich, and tastes like butter. Thank goodness. You consider licking the lamb-shaped one out of sheer gratitude. Your host pours milk into a shallow bowl and dusts it with sugar, rose water, and a dash of vinegar. Pass it, they announce. You take a sip. It's warm. It's curdled. Coats your tongue like a milky spiderweb. Posset was once a go-to remedy for colds, and sometimes an aphrodisiac. Shakespeare even mentioned it. But you're pretty sure it's plotting something in your stomach right now. Just when you think you've hit the end, someone presents a wedge of blue cheese. This one is marbled with green veins, smells like wet hay, and tastes like battery acid left in a barn. You make the mistake of breathing through your nose while chewing. Everything burns. You wash it down with a spoonful of sweet curd, a soft cheese blended with honey, cinnamon, and orange peel. It's surprisingly nice, delicate, soft, like the milk finally forgave you. The dairy course has been an emotional roller coaster. You started hopeful. You ended cultured and mildly lactose intolerant. You stare at your spoon. It trembles slightly. No one tells you this, but in medieval times, a dinner guest who survived the jelly and cheese rounds without fainting was considered either nobility or suspiciously magical. Congratulations. You might be both. Your stomach has seen things it may never recover from. And yet, against all odds, you remain upright, still at the table, still vaguely sentient. But just as your internal organs prepare for peace, your host rubs their hands together and exclaims, "Now for the pies!" Your soul leaves your body again. Pie sounds delightful, comforting, crusty, maybe even fruity? You're wrong. Again, because these aren't dessert pies. These are medieval meat pies. Dense, spicy, questionable. Your first dish is placed before you. A thick brown pastry, sealed like a tomb. You crack it open. Steam escapes, heavy with spices and something else. Inside, a mash of minced pork, raisins, hard-boiled eggs, saffron, and wait for it, sugar. Yes, this is a sweet, salty meat pie. You take a cautious bite. It's hot. Clove punches you in the back of the throat. The pork is oily, the raisins defy logic, and the eggs, well, they're just confused to be here. A mainstream historical fact. Medieval pies were less about the filling and more about preservation. The pastry coffin was often inedible, just a hard, flour and water shell designed to keep meat from spoiling. Pies were sealed, baked, sometimes rebaked and stored for weeks. In a time before cling film, this was basically Tupperware. Your next pie is a surprise. Literally, it's called a coffin pie, and inside is a live bird. The lid is cracked, and a pigeon flaps out in a panic, wings smacking your neighbor in the face. Your host laughs like this happens every Thursday. These theatrical pies, filled with frogs, birds, or even dwarves in armor, yes, once, were a medieval dinner trick, part entertainment, part status symbol. It showed you had money to waste on animal antics. Historians still argue whether these were common occurrences or exaggerated tales, but the recipes exist, right there in cookbooks like the For Me of Curry. You stare at the empty pie and wonder if your dinner has become a performance. Are you the jester now? Another pie arrives. This one smells of fish. You brace yourself. It's lamprey pie. Lampreys are jawless, eel-like creatures with terrifying sucker mouths. Highly prized by nobility, they were considered both exotic and medicinal. Some monarchs demanded lamprey pies for every feast. Henry I allegedly died after eating a surfeit of lampreys, though historians debate whether it was the fish, the wine, or just royal stress. The pie is peppery and dark. You chew carefully. It's rich, oily, and oddly earthy. Not pleasant, but not as terrifying as its face. Your host beams. This next one's a real treat. A pie of umble meat. You blink. Humble pie, yes, but not in the metaphorical sense. This pie is made from umbles. Animal innards like liver, heart, lungs, and kidneys, usually deer, chopped fine, stewed, heavily seasoned, then baked. The smell is metallic. The flavor is deep, muddy, and spiced to oblivion. You chew politely and mentally file this under things to forget. The phrase eating humble pie may actually stem from this dish, once considered food for servants or lower-class folk, though some argue it was simply the part of the deer left over after the Lord took the good cuts. Either way, you now know humility firsthand. Then comes a pie with a golden crust, adorned with a tiny flag. Pork and apple, says your host. You're suspicious. You take a bite. And it's good? The pork is tender. The apples are soft and tart. The spices, cinnamon, mace, are oddly modern. It reminds you of holiday leftovers. It's rich but not revolting. You take a second bite. The third. Then they bring out another beef and prune. You raise an eyebrow but give it a shot. The prunes add a sticky sweetness. It works. Now you're rolling. Pie after pie, pigeon with grapes, chicken with almond milk, even hare and ginger, each one strange but weirdly compelling. You hit a rhythm. You're winning the pie game until they bring out the egg pie. It's beige, eggy, oddly sweet, more like a flan than a frittata. You taste it and immediately regret it. It's cold, claggy, sugary and sulfurous all at once. You chew with increasing dread. A fringe tidbit. Some medieval pies contained medicinal ingredients, like ground pearls, ambergris, or crushed emeralds, not for flavor, but for perceived health benefits. Because if your pie doesn't sparkle, are you even a real noble? You silently pray your next slice contains no gemstones. Instead, they bring out funeral pie. It's black, made with boiled blood, flour, and black treacle. A grim dish served during mourning. The crust is burnt, the filling coppery and thick. You take a bite out of respect. Tastes like pennies and sadness. Your host, undeterred, brings out the finale, the great pie. It's enormous, decorated with sculpted birds, leaves, and medieval creatures. The crust is shiny with egg wash. You lean in. It smells confusing. Inside beef, lamb, eel, dates, pine nuts, cheese, eggs, and sugar, all in one. A Frankenstein's monster of food. Historians still argue whether these massive combo pies were really eaten or mostly ornamental. Some believe only the outer crust and gravy were consumed. Others insist the whole chaotic mix was meant to represent unity. Land, sea, garden, and dairy all in one bite. You take that bite. You don't speak for several minutes afterward. It's too much. It's everything. It's nothing. Your tongue can't find purchase in this multi-meat labyrinth. You gently set your fork down. The pie wins. A brief silence falls over the table, and then someone pushes forward a pie that looks entirely normal. You raise an eyebrow. What's in this one? You ask. Cherries. Your host says. You hesitate, then taste. It's tart, bright, sweet. The crust flakes perfectly. For the first time all night, your mouth remembers joy. You close your eyes. Let the cherry finish linger. It's a fleeting moment of peace. This pie. A reminder that even in the medieval world of horror and jellied entrails, someone somewhere had the idea to put fruit in a crust and not mess with it. You open your eyes. Your plate is empty. You survived the pies. Barely. You lean back in your chair. Your stomach, once a bold adventurer, now lies curled in a corner of your abdomen, quietly reevaluating life choices. But there's no reprieve. Your host claps their hands once more, eyes twinkling. It's time for the wet course, they declare. You blink slowly. The what course? They grin. Soups, broths, stews. Things that squish and slurp. You don't know whether to run or sob. The first bowl arrives with a slosh. Pottage. The quintessential medieval stew. At first glance, it looks like overcooked oatmeal. You take a spoonful. It's warm, mushy, slightly salty. There's a chunk of something, barley, parsnip, meat. You try not to identify it and just chew. A mainstream historical fact. Pottage was the great equalizer of medieval cuisine. Rich or poor, everyone ate it. The difference was in the ingredients. Nobles added beef, saffron, and almonds. Peasants made do with onions, turnips, and lentils. Left simmering all day, it was the ultimate whatever's in the pot meal. Then comes a darker stew, thick, oily, flecked with something red. Your host whispers dramatically, "Blood broth." You stare. It's exactly what it sounds like. Animal blood, often pig or goose, mixed with wine, vinegar, and spices, simmered into a dense, iron-heavy liquid. You take a sip, coats your tongue like syrup, metallic, sweet, sharp, like drinking liquid pennies with a pinch of clove. Your host, noticing your expression, chimes in cheerily, "It's good for the humors." Ah yes, the medieval obsession with bodily fluids. Too much black bile? Have some spleen soup. Feeling anxious? Try leek broth with crushed pearls. It's all very scientific. Spoiler, it's not. Next up is frumenty, boiled cracked wheat in milk. This one's almost gentle. Creamy, porridge-like, and flecked with saffron. A fringe detail? Some versions included chunks of fish. For fasting days, of course. Because if you're denying yourself meat, why not throw a herring in your breakfast? You shovel it down quickly before anyone tries to improve it further. The next course arrives in a carved wooden bowl, steaming with a murky broth dotted with green oil. It smells like fish and mint and something vaguely herbal. You sip. It's eel stew. The texture is gelatinous. The flavor is bold, slippery, and suspiciously sweet. You bite down on a vertebrae. Crunch. Historians still argue whether eel was truly beloved or just endlessly available. It shows up in dozens of medieval recipes, particularly during Lent, when meat was forbidden. Some nobles even had private eel ponds. Peasants? They caught them in muddy ditches. Either way, eel was the chicken of medieval waters. Next comes a green broth. You peer into it. It's glowing, made with spinach, parsley, sage, and leeks, then thickened with bread or egg yolks. It smells earthy, fresh, and slightly grassy. You sip. It tastes like someone made soup out of a meadow. Not the worst. In fact, it's a welcome break from blood. But the break doesn't last. A bowl is placed in front of you. It jiggles. It's milk soup, but not in the nice cereal kind of way. This one's made of almond milk, egg yolks, rosewater, and verjuice. It's floral, custardy, and sour all at once. You make the mistake of taking a big spoonful. It hits you like a lukewarm milkshake laced with perfume. Your host claps with joy. Now we get fancy. A gleaming tureen is presented with ceremony. Inside, swan stew. Yes, swan. In the Middle Ages, swans weren't just for lake gazing. They were royal delicacies, served at coronations, weddings, or just when the local lord wanted to flex. The stew is rich, fatty, and aggressively gamey. You chew the meat slowly. It's like duck's bitter cousin who holds grudges. Your spoon hits something hard, a decorative claw. You push the bowl away. Another arrives, hedgehog broth. You hesitate, then remember that in medieval England, hedgehogs were sometimes eaten, usually by boiling them after removing their quills. Folk medicine claimed their meat cured everything from baldness to back pain. This version, however, is likely just pork shaped into hedgehogs, floating in a broth with saffron, vinegar, and raisins. You taste. It's better than it sounds. Sweet and savory. The meat's tender, but the mental image lingers. You sip some water. tastes like onions. Of course, your host, now practically vibrating with excitement, brings out gruel. Just gruel. Water, oats, and a hint of salt. A punishment by texture. One fringe tale claims that monks would make their gruel with holy water for divine digestion. You aren't feeling very blessed right now. And then they bring the ale broth. Yes, soup made with ale. It smells like wet bread and hangovers. You take a sip and immediately regret it. It's bitter, warm, and strangely frothy. Your stomach makes a small protest sound. You ignore it. You must, because next comes capon in milk sauce, a kind of creamy chicken soup, thickened with almonds and rice. The chicken is tender, the sauce smooth. Feels reasonable, safe even. You savor it. A single island of calm in a storm of questionable liquids. Your host bows. Last, but not least, bread broth. It's literally stale bread boiled in water and flavored with herbs. It smells like wet cardboard. You taste. Confirms your suspicions. But in lean seasons, this was survival food. Waste nothing. Even crumbs had value. You pause. Suddenly, all the stews and broths begin to blur together. Green, brown, red, thick, thin. You've been dunked, spooned, slurped, and brothed beyond recognition. The table swims. Your spoon drips. You swear the bowl is whispering. You look down at your reflection. It blinks. You blink back. And then your host says those two final, horrifying words. Next course. Your body has entered a fugue state. Somewhere deep inside, your organs are negotiating a ceasefire. But up here, on the surface, your host is announcing something new with the enthusiasm of a game show host who's just revealed a new car. Welcome, they say, to the jelly course. You try to stand. You don't make it far. A shimmering platter is placed before you, and it's moving, wobbling, quivering. The first jelly is translucent green and molded into the shape of a swan. You reach for your spoon with something like dread. You scoop a bite. The savory, cold, tastes like herbed meat broth that somehow got refrigerated. That's because it did. Medieval jelly wasn't dessert. It was aspic, a savory jelly made from boiled animal parts. Hooves, bones, cartilage, cooked down until the collagen creates a gelatinous stock. That liquid is then cooled and molded around meats, fish, or even whole eggs. It's wobbly meat armor. For fun, a mainstream historical fact. Aspic was considered a delicacy and a display of wealth. Being able to serve cold, gelatin-set meat meant you had access to both time and resources. It showed off your kitchen staff skill and your dining guests' bravery. The next dish arrives in a molded dome, jellied eel. Again, you stare at it. You thought you were done with eel. But here it is, suspended in a golden jelly, like a villain trapped in amber. You take a bite. Cold, slippery, fishy. The texture is alien. The flavor is bold. It's like licking a gelatin-slick dock. You close your eyes and breathe. The next jelly appears, clear with delicate red streaks. Your host says it's rabbit in clove-spiced aspic. You try it. Okay, the rabbit's tender. The jelly has hints of vinegar and spice, but your brain keeps insisting that this should be dessert. Then they bring out the red jelly. You think finally something sweet. It is not. This blood jelly, made from pig's blood and red wine, seasoned with nutmeg and sugar, set into a glossy crimson mold. You scoop a spoonful. It's rich, sticky, slightly metallic, sweet on the tongue, iron on the finish, like Dracula's dessert bar. One fringe tidbit. Some jellies were made decorative by suspending flowers, herbs, or even gold leaf inside them. Others were layered with bright colors: beetroot for red, spinach for green, saffron for gold, turning the humble aspic into a medieval lava lamp of meat. Another platter appears, this one covered in glistening, jiggling domes. There's fish in white wine jelly, lamb in mint aspic, chicken in rosewater gel. You're not sure what's meat and what's mold. Historians still argue whether these jellied concoctions were actually enjoyed or simply tolerated as a way to preserve food. After all, refrigeration didn't exist. A cold jelly could keep meat edible for longer. Whether or not it improved the taste, well, you're living proof it didn't. Then comes the jellied egg. Yes, a hard-boiled egg suspended in a pale yellow jelly, like a forgotten science project. You eat it, fights back. Your host, unfazed, presents the next horror: jelly of tongues. You don't even blink anymore. Slices of cow tongue, arranged in gelatin, topped with edible violets. It's meant to be beautiful. You take a bite. It's chewy, cold, with the unsettling mouthfeel of a soft rubber shoe. And then, a brief moment of mercy. A pineade jelly, made with almond milk, sugar, and pine nuts. Sweet, delicate, almost pudding-like. You sigh with relief. It doesn't last. Because next up is spiced brain jelly. You look at your host. Sorry, did you say brain? They nod with glee. Sheep's brain, blended with egg yolk and cinnamon, then set with veal stock. A marvel of texture. You take a bite. The jelly trembles. So do you. It's creamy, earthy, a little nutty, a lot wrong. You wonder if your own brain is trying to escape through your ears. Another round. This one's a multi-layered jelly. Chicken followed by boiled carrots, then a thin gelatin line, then chopped herbs in aspic, then a surprise cube of pork. A meat trifle, a testament to culinary chaos. A fringe fact: some banquet jellies were sculptural, castles, lions, coats of arms, all molded from gelatinous meat goo. One French noble famously had an entire battlefield rendered in jelly. It jiggled into history. You take a sip of water. Tastes like meat now. Everything tastes like meat. Next comes wine jelly, made with spiced red wine, honey, and isinglass. Gelatin extracted from fish bladders. This one, at least, is sweet, fruity, almost festive. You're nearly happy. Then your host announces the final plate, the gilded boar's head jelly. You freeze. It's exactly what it sounds like. A boar's head set upright in a mold, its mouth open in silent scream, encased in shimmering aspic with floating herbs and edible flowers. The centerpiece, the piece de resistance, the crime scene. You're handed a spoon. You decline with a polite, "I'm full." No one minds, because by now everyone is quiet, weary, defeated by gelatin. You lean back, eyes half closed, as the last bowl is cleared. You did it. You survived the jelly course. Barely. But the question isn't if you can keep going. The question is, what on earth comes next? Your host answers before you can ask. With a grin. Now, they say, Let's talk about beverages. You'd hoped for water, just a little water, maybe something cold and clear, simple, kind, forgiving, but no. Your host claps, and the first goblet arrives. Ornate, heavy, glinting gold in the candlelight. Mead, they say with a flourish, the drink of warriors, poets, and very sticky monks. You sip, the sweet, like honey dissolved in a warm bath. It fizzes just enough to remind you this is alcohol, but not enough to distract you from the fact that this is basically medieval soda with a buzz. Mead was everywhere in the Middle Ages, a mainstream fact. It predates both wine and beer in some regions, and was particularly prized in early Anglo-Saxon and Norse cultures. Monasteries brewed it, nobles hoarded it, poets sang about it. But mead is just the opening act. A squat ceramic mug is placed before you next, steaming from the rim. Pass it, your host says proudly. You eye it warily. It's milk, hot, curdled milk, mixed with ale then spiced. It smells like someone made oatmeal, added beer, and gave up halfway. You sip, thick, tart, like yogurt had a nervous breakdown. In medieval times, posset was often a sleep aid or a remedy for colds. People even added crushed almonds or eggs to make it more nourishing, or just to make it more horrifying, depending on your constitution. One fringe tidbit: some possets were thickened so heavily with bread or breadcrumbs that they became more spoonable than drinkable. You didn't sip posset, you shoveled it. The next cup is darker, thicker, smells of cloves, vinegar, and is that pepper? Is hippocras, a spiced wine, often sweetened with honey and strained through cloth. Medieval bartenders, aka servants with very strong wrists, would prepare it for feasts, pouring it over hippocras bags stuffed with cinnamon, ginger, and long pepper. You drink. It's oddly good, like mulled wine's intense cousin who went to art school and now hosts solstice parties. Historians still argue whether hippocras was purely recreational or medicinal. Some recipes claim it aided digestion, others that it made you hallucinate less after spoiled meat. Either way, your lips are numb. Next arrives a thick, pale liquid in a wooden cup. Egg ale, your host says. A frothy treat. You blink. It's ale, with raw egg whipped in, plus honey, and sometimes warm goat's milk. You sip. It tastes like beer and breakfast had an argument and no one won. Clings to your mouth like regret. You chase it with a quick gulp of something clear. Mistela, they announce. A wine fortified with brandy and soaked in fruit skins and herbs. It's syrupy, like adult cough medicine. But then things get crunchy. They hand you a clay cup filled with something that rattles. You peek inside. It's aleberry, ale simmered with sugar and stale bread, sometimes with raisins. It's like cereal and beer in the same bowl. You take a bite slurp. It's oddly comforting, like sad French toast. And then there's wassail. Yes, that holiday song has roots in medieval drinking traditions. Wassail was a hot punch made with ale or wine, spiced with nutmeg, cinnamon, apples, and served in a communal bowl. Picture drunken villagers shouting wassail around a fire, toasting health and scaring evil spirits with noise and breath that could strip paint. You drink. It's rich, spiced, and deeply alcoholic. You momentarily forgive everything, until they bring the wormwood wine. It smells like death and dentist visits. Bitter doesn't cover it. Wormwood was used medicinally, believed to cure everything from worms, hence the name, to melancholy. But it also had a taste that medieval texts politely called challenging. You take a sip, your tongue recoils, your teeth file a complaint. The next concoction is thick and murky. Oily bubbles drift on the surface. Oxymel, says your host. Vinegar, honey, water, sometimes herbs. A supposed tonic designed to boost energy, aid digestion, and wake the dead. You drink. Your face folds inward. A fringe fact? Some monks used oxymel to dissolve medicinal powders or to preserve herbs. Others probably used it to ward off visitors. Finally, a silver chalice, cool to the touch. Inside, rosewater lemonade. Your soul leaps. The sweet, light, aromatic, like someone distilled joy. You drain the cup, but then they pour milk punch. Cold milk, curdled with lemon juice, filtered until clear, then mixed with brandy and nutmeg. A medieval cocktail. It looks like water, but hits like a small, creamy thunderstorm. You're sweating now. One more? Your host insists. Prunelle, they whisper. Plum brandy, a favorite of apothecaries and the terminally bored. It burns. You see colors. You briefly forget your own name. Historians still debate which of these drinks were staples and which were novelties. Some likely faded from fashion due to cost, scarcity, or just sheer trauma. But for now, they're all here, in your belly, brewing. Your fingers twitch. You sit back. You have tasted the feasts of the medieval world. From pigeon pie to posset. From blood pudding to brandy steeped in plums. You are no longer the same person who sat down at this table. And neither is your stomach. Now breathe deep, because the fire is low. The table's empty. The storm of jellies and stews and blood wine has passed. And you strange, brave soul, are still standing. Barely. You close your eyes. The last of the flickering candlelight dances behind your eyelids. The long wooden table has gone quiet. The clatter of bowls and scraping of spoons now just a memory drifting in the air like wood smoke. Your stomach, once loud and rebellious, settles into a slow, tired rhythm, like waves against a distant shore. You think of that first sip of mead, the curve of the jelly, the bite of cold eel. It feels like years ago, and now, here in this quiet moment, surrounded by velvet shadows and soft hums of night, the medieval world begins to slip away. The roaring feasts, the strange textures, the jellied birds, they blur into a tapestry of flickering scenes. Like dreams half remembered, the fire cracks. A gentle breeze moves the curtains. Somewhere, an owl calls. You are warm, full, safe, and maybe, just maybe, a little wiser. Perhaps next time you look at your pantry, you'll appreciate the simple things. The bread that isn't boiled. The milk that hasn't been curdled on purpose. The gelatin that isn't meat-based. You'll raise your glass of modern lemonade, not oxymel, and toast to the peculiar, persistent, occasionally revolting resilience of the past. Let your thoughts drift now. Let your breath slow. Let your body sink deep into the softness beneath you. No more stew. No more jelly. No more tongue-shaped anything. Only rest. Only stillness. Only dreams.